Hey guys, tonight we're traveling to the heart of central Mexico, to a place that might just be the most productive agricultural system ever developed by human ingenuity. You might think you know what farming looks like: fields stretching to the horizon, neat rows of crops, dusty soil that needs constant irrigation. But tonight, we're going to show you something completely different. Gardens that float on water, that produce food year-round, that can feed 10 times more people per acre than almost any other farming method in history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me what city you're in and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far this community spreads across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a wooden dock in the pre-dawn darkness, the air cool and carrying the distinctive scent of water and wet earth. This is Lake Xochimilco in the Valley of Mexico, and around you the world is just beginning to wake. Birds are calling from the reeds, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the splash of something moving through the water, maybe a fish, maybe an early riser setting out in a canoe. A weathered boat pulls up to the dock, and the old man steering it gestures for you to climb in. The canoe is long and narrow, carved from a single tree trunk, and it rocks gently as you step in. You settle onto the wooden plank that serves as a seat, and the old man pushes off from the dock with a practiced thrust of his pole. The canoe glides silently away from the shore, out onto the lake that has been the lifeblood of this region for thousands of years. As your eyes adjust to the growing light, you begin to see the landscape around you. This isn't quite like any lake you've seen before. The water is broken up by narrow channels winding between what appear to be small islands, long rectangular plots of land, each one covered in green growing things. These are the chinampas, the floating gardens that made the Valley of Mexico one of the most densely populated regions in the Americas before the Spanish arrived. The old man poles the canoe with rhythmic, effortless motions. He's been navigating these waters since he was a child, just as his father did, and his father before him. The technique hasn't changed much in centuries. Find the bottom with the pole, push, glide, repeat. It's peaceful, meditative work, and you find yourself relaxing into the rhythm of the journey. The sun begins to rise over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The light catches on the water, creating pathways of glitter between the chinampas. And now you can see more clearly what these floating gardens really are. Each one is a rectangle of earth and vegetation, anchored to the lake bottom by willow trees whose roots reach down through the soil and into the water beneath. The surfaces are covered in crops: maize standing tall, beans climbing up stalks, squash vines spreading across the ground. What's most remarkable is how organized it all is. The chinampas are arranged in a precise grid, separated by narrow canals that serve as both irrigation channels and transportation routes. It's an entire city laid out on water, but instead of buildings, the plots are filled with food. It's agriculture as urban planning, farming as architecture, and it's all happening right here on the surface of a lake. Your guide steers the canoe down one of the canals, and you pass close enough to see individual plants. The soil looks incredibly rich, dark, moist, almost black. And that's one of the secrets of the Chinampas. This soil isn't really soil at all, or at least not in the way we usually think of it. It's lakebed muck, accumulated over centuries, constantly renewed as farmers scrape up nutrient-rich material from the canal bottoms and spread it on their plots. It's a self-renewing fertility system, one that requires no artificial fertilizers and never seems to wear out. The canoe rounds a bend and you see people at work. Farmers attending their plots, some standing on the chinampas themselves, others working from small canal-side boats. A woman in bright embroidered clothing is harvesting chilies, dropping them into a basket strapped to her back. Two men are transplanting maize seedlings, working with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this task thousands of times before. What strikes you is how calm everything is. There's no machinery here, no motors or tractors, no sounds of mechanized farming, just the splash of poles in water, the quiet conversations of people at work, the rustle of plants in the gentle breeze. This is agriculture on a human scale, farming that works with natural rhythms rather than trying to overpower them. As you continue through the maze of canals, you begin to understand the scale of this system. The Chinampas stretch as far as you can see, thousands of individual plots covering the surface of the lake. Each one is small, maybe 30 meters long and 3 or 4 meters wide, but together they create an agricultural landscape capable of feeding an enormous population. This is productivity that European farmers of the same period could barely comprehend, achieved through techniques developed not in universities or research stations, but through generations of careful observation and experimentation. The old man poles the canoe toward a slightly larger chinampa, where several families appear to be working together. He pulls alongside and gestures for you to step out onto the firm, if slightly spongy, surface. You're standing on a floating farm, a garden that shouldn't exist but does, brilliantly and abundantly. Beneath your feet you can feel the slight give that tells you this is truly floating, not solid ground, but it feels stable enough, secure enough that you could imagine working here day after day without a second thought. The soil is dark and rich between the crops, and when you kneel down to touch it, your fingers sink in slightly. It's cool and moist, loaded with organic matter, the kind of soil that modern gardeners dream about but can rarely achieve. This is the miracle of the Chinampas soil that constantly renews itself, fertility that doesn't deplete, productivity that doesn't decline over time. The farmers here don't need to let fields lie fallow to recover. They don't need to rotate crops in the way conventional farmers do. The constant input of nutrient-rich material from the lake bottom means their gardens are always productive, always ready for the next planting. As you stand on this floating garden, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, you begin to understand why this system was so successful. It's not just one innovation, but many, working together in a carefully balanced whole. The water provides irrigation without effort. The lakebed muck provides constant fertility. The arrangement of canals and plots creates microclimates that extend growing seasons. The willow trees anchor the gardens while also providing wood and other useful products. Everything serves multiple purposes. Nothing is wasted. You're about to learn how this extraordinary system came to be, how it was built and maintained, and how it fed a civilization that, at its peak, supported hundreds of thousands of people in what is now Mexico City. But first, take a moment to appreciate where you are standing on a floating farm that represents one of humanity's greatest agricultural achievements, a system so productive and sustainable that it's still in use today, more than 500 years after it was first developed. The sun is fully up now, and the Chinampa landscape is spreading out before you in all its complexity and beauty. What at first appeared to be a simple grid of rectangular plots reveals itself to be something far more sophisticated, a carefully designed agricultural ecosystem where every element has been shaped and positioned to maximize productivity while maintaining balance. From your vantage point on this slightly elevated chinampa, you can see the pattern clearly. The plots are arranged in long rows, separated by canals that run in two directions. The narrower canals, perhaps 2 meters across, provide access for individual farmers and small boats. Wider canals, maybe 4 or 5 meters across, serve as main transportation routes, allowing larger loads of produce to be moved efficiently from the gardens to markets. It's a hierarchical system of waterways, not unlike the network of streets and avenues in a conventional city, but designed for boats and poles rather than carts and horses. What's particularly striking is how uniform the chinampas are. Each plot is roughly the same size and shape, suggesting that this isn't haphazard development, but planned landscape architecture. The dimensions aren't random. 30 meters long by 3 meters wide is close to the standard, a size that's large enough to be productive, but small enough to be worked by a single family. It's human-scale agriculture, where the unit of production matches the unit of labor. The surfaces of the chinampas are slightly higher than the water level, maybe 20 or 30 centimeters above the surface. This isn't an accident, it's precisely calculated. The soil needs to be moist but not waterlogged, and maintaining the right elevation is crucial for plant health. Too low and the crops drown. Too high and they dry out. The farmers have learned through centuries of experience exactly where the soil level should be relative to the water, and they maintain this level through careful management. You notice that the edges of each chinampa are reinforced with woven mats of reeds and rushes. These serve multiple purposes. They keep the soil from washing away into the canals, they provide stability to the overall structure, and they create a defined boundary between plots. Some of the more recently established chinampas show this reinforcing layer clearly, while on older plots it has been incorporated into the soil itself, hidden beneath layers of accumulated muck and vegetation. The willow trees that anchor the chinampas are planted at regular intervals along the edges. Their root systems reach down through the soil and into the lake bottom below, effectively tying the floating garden to the earth beneath. But the willows serve more than just this structural function. They provide shade for workers and for certain crops that prefer partial sun. Their leaves can be used for animal fodder or medicine. Their branches can be harvested for fuel or construction materials. Like everything in the chinampa system, the willows are multifunctional. As you look more closely at the planting patterns, you see something interesting. The crops aren't arranged in simple monocultures. Instead, each chinampa contains multiple species growing together. Maize forms the tall canopy, beans climb up the maize stalks, squash vines spread across the ground between them. This is the famous Three Sisters planting method that Mesoamerican farmers developed over thousands of years, a companion planting system where each species supports the others. The beans fix nitrogen in the swile, the maize provides a trellis for the beans to climb, and the squash shades the swile to retain moisture and suppress weeds. But there's more than just the Three Sisters growing here. You see chilies, tomatoes, tomatillos, herbs, both culinary and medicinal. Some chinampas are dedicated entirely to flowers, marigolds, zinnias, other blooms that have both aesthetic and practical uses. The diversity is staggering, especially when you consider that all of this is happening on plots that float on water. The canals themselves are alive with activity. Small boats move along the waterways. some carrying farmers to and from their plots, others loaded with produce headed to market. You see fishermen casting nets, harvesting the fish and aquatic birds that are another important protein source from this aquatic landscape. The canals aren't just irrigation channels or transportation routes, they're also productive ecosystems in their own right. Something else catches your attention. The water level in the canals varies. Some canals are deeper than others, and you can see sluice gates and simple dams that control the flow of water between different sections of the Chinampa system. This isn't just passive flooding, it's active water management, a sophisticated hydrological system that allows farmers to control water levels with considerable precision. You notice that the Chinampas are oriented in a particular direction relative to the sun and wind. The long axes run roughly east-west, which means that the narrow ends face north and south. This orientation maximizes sunlight exposure while minimizing the effects of drying winds. It's a subtle design feature, but one that makes a significant difference in crop productivity and water retention. What you're looking at isn't just farming, it's landscape engineering on a massive scale. The people who created this system didn't just dig a few canals and pile up some mud. They thought through the relationship between sun and water, wind and crop, soil and canal. They designed a system that worked with natural forces rather than against them, creating productivity through careful alignment with local conditions. The old man who brought you here is pointing out different features, explaining in a mix of Spanish and Nahuatl, the indigenous Aztec language that is still spoken in this region, how everything works. He shows you how farmers test soil moisture by feel, how they adjust water levels using simple gates, how they know when to add fresh muck to their plots based on the appearance and growth of their plants. This isn't book learning, it's knowledge encoded in practice, passed down through generations of hands-on experience. What's particularly remarkable is that this system was developed without any of the tools we consider essential for modern engineering. No surveying equipment, no hydrological studies, no agricultural research stations. Instead, the Chinampas emerged from centuries of accumulated knowledge, from trial and error, from careful observation of what worked and what didn't. Each generation added to the understanding they inherited, gradually refining and perfecting techniques that had been developed by their ancestors. As you continue to observe the Chinampa landscape, you begin to appreciate it as a living technology, not a static creation, but a dynamic system that's constantly being adjusted and improved. The farmers here aren't just following a recipe handed down from the past, they're actively adapting to changing conditions, experimenting with new techniques, and modifying traditional practices based on new challenges and opportunities. The Chinampas may be ancient, but they're not fossils. They're a living agricultural tradition that continues to evolve. You're standing in the middle of one of humanity's most impressive agricultural achievements, a system so productive and sustainable that it supported the growth of one of the largest cities in the world before the modern era. And what's most amazing is that it was all accomplished without what we usually think of as advanced technology, just careful observation, patient experimentation, and a deep understanding of local ecosystems. To truly understand the Chinampas, you need to understand the landscape that gave birth to them. So let's take a step back in time and look at the Valley of Mexico as it existed before the Spanish arrival, before Mexico City rose to dominate the region. What you would have seen was an extraordinary endorheic basin, a closed valley that doesn't drain to the ocean, surrounded by mountains and volcanoes that create a natural bowl. The valley contained not one lake, but 5 interconnected bodies of water, each with its own character and each playing a different role in the regional ecosystem. Lake Zumpango and Lake Xaltocan in the north were relatively shallow and saline. Lake Xochimilco and Lake Chalco in the south were freshwater lakes fed by springs and rivers. And in the center, connecting them all, was Lake Texcoco, the largest and deepest of the five, brackish water that fluctuated dramatically with the rainy and dry seasons. This lake system was the foundation for everything that followed. The water provided transportation routes through a valley where the rough terrain made overland travel difficult. The lake supported abundant fish and waterfowl, providing protein that complemented the agricultural produce grown on the Chinampas. And the lakes themselves, through their seasonal fluctuations and varying salinity levels, created the environmental conditions that made Chinampa agriculture possible. The valley floor sits at an elevation of about 2,200 meters above sea level, high enough to have a mild climate that avoids the extreme heat of lower elevations, but low enough to support year-round agriculture. The surrounding mountains, some of them active volcanoes, provide a dramatic backdrop, but also create the enclosed basin that contains the lakes. Rain that falls in the valley has nowhere to go but into the lakes, which then lose water only through evaporation. This creates a delicate hydrological balance that the people who lived here learned to manage with great sophistication. The human history of the valley stretches back thousands of years, long before the Aztecs arrived on the scene. Archaeological evidence shows that people were practicing some form of wetland agriculture in this region as early as 1000 BCE. The techniques that would eventually evolve into fully developed chinampas emerged gradually over centuries, as different cultures contributed innovations and refinements. The Aztecs, who established their capital of Tenochtitlan around 1325 CE, didn't invent chinampa agriculture, but they perfected it and scaled it up to support their growing empire. What's particularly interesting about the valley's geography is how it concentrated population and resources. The lakes were essentially a transportation network that connected different parts of the valley, making it possible to move goods and people efficiently across what would otherwise be difficult terrain. This connectivity allowed for the development of specialized communities, some focused on fishing, others on farming, still others on craft production, and the exchange of goods and ideas between them. The climate of the valley is relatively stable, with a distinct rainy season from roughly May to October, and a dry season from November to April. This seasonal pattern posed challenges for farmers, but the Chinampas were uniquely suited to handle it. During the rainy season, excess water could flow into the canals and be managed through the system of dikes and sluice gates. During the dry season, the stored water in the lakes and the moisture-retaining properties of the Chinampa soil ensured that crops could continue to grow even when rain was scarce. The volcanic soil of the surrounding mountains is incredibly fertile, and erosion from these highlands continuously brought mineral-rich sediment into the lakes. This sediment settled to the bottom, creating the deep layers of nutrient-dense muck that Chinampa farmers would eventually harvest to fertilize their gardens. In a sense, the Chinampa system was a way of bringing this underwater fertility up to the surface, where it could support agricultural production. The valley was also rich in other natural resources that supported the development of complex society. Obsidian from volcanic deposits provided excellent raw material for tools and weapons. The mountains provided stone for construction. The forests supplied wood for fuel and building materials. But it was the lakes, and particularly the agricultural system that developed in and around them, that made the valley capable of supporting such high population densities. What's crucial to understand is that the Chinampa system didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a larger regional economy and ecosystem. Farmers on the Chinampas traded their produce for goods and services from other parts of the valley and beyond. Fishermen and hunters provided protein from the lakes and surrounding wetlands. Craftsmen in the growing cities produced the tools and goods that Chinampa farmers needed. The Chinampas were the agricultural foundation, but they were supported by and in turn supported a complex web of economic relationships. The Spanish, when they first saw this system, were both impressed and baffled. They came from an agricultural tradition based on fields and ploughs, on dry land farming that struggled with water scarcity and soil depletion. The idea of gardens that floated on water, that produced food year-round with apparent effortlessness, seemed almost miraculous. What they couldn't see was the enormous amount of knowledge and skill that went into creating and maintaining this system. The generations of accumulated wisdom about water, soil, plants, and climate that made the Chinampas possible. The valley has changed dramatically since those days. The lakes have been largely drained or filled in. Mexico City now covers much of what was once water, but in Xochimilco and a few other areas, remnants of the Chinampa system survive, still productive after 5 centuries. These surviving Chinampas aren't just archaeological curiosities, they're working farms that continue to feed people in the Mexico City area, using essentially the same techniques that their ancestors developed centuries ago. As you consider the geography that gave birth to the Chinampas, what emerges is a picture of extraordinary fit between human innovation and environmental conditions. The Chinampas weren't imposed on the landscape from outside. They emerged from a deep understanding of local conditions, from careful observation of how water, soil, and climate interacted in this specific place. The result was an agricultural system perfectly adapted to its environment, capable of producing abundance while maintaining ecological balance. This is perhaps the most important lesson the Chinampas have to offer us. The most sustainable and productive agricultural systems are those that work with local conditions rather than trying to override them. The people who developed the Chinampas didn't try to remake the Valley of Mexico into something else. Instead, they asked what the valley could support, what its unique conditions made possible, and then developed techniques that maximized those possibilities. The result was an agricultural miracle that continues to inspire us today. You've seen the finished Chinampas, those rectangular gardens floating productively on the water, but now it's time to understand how they're created. The old man guides his canoe to an area where a new Chinampa is being built, and what you witness is a construction process that's both surprisingly simple and ingeniously sophisticated. Building a Chinampa begins with location selection. Not all parts of the lake are equally suitable for new gardens. The water needs to be the right depth, shallow enough to reach the lake bottom, but deep enough to maintain adequate water flow around the finished Chinampa. The soil at the bottom needs to be suitable for anchoring, and the location needs to fit into the overall pattern of canals and plots that makes the system work as a whole. The old men who make these decisions carry generations of knowledge about where Chinampas will thrive and where they'll fail. Once a site is selected, construction begins with marking out the boundaries. The new Chinampa will follow the standard dimensions, about 30 meters long and 3 to 4 meters wide, oriented the same way as existing plots to maintain the overall grid pattern. Stakes are driven into the lake bottom to mark the corners, and strings are stretched between them to define the edges. The next step is creating the foundational layer that will eventually support the Chinampa's soil. Workers begin by weaving mats from tough aquatic reeds and rushes, plants that grow abundantly in the lake shallows. These mats are enormous, covering the entire area of the proposed chinampa, and they're woven tightly enough to contain soil but loosely enough to allow water to pass through. The weaving process is skilled work. Too tight and the mat won't drain properly, too loose and the soil will wash away. These woven mats are anchored to the lake bottom using long poles driven through them into the sediment beneath. The poles serve a dual purpose. They hold the mats in place during construction, and they eventually become part of the chinampa's structural support system, reaching from the soil surface down to the lake bottom below. Once the foundational mats are in place, the real building begins. Workers using small boats bring basket after basket of mud and muck from the lake bottom, carefully spreading it over the mats to create an even layer. This isn't random material. The most experienced workers know exactly which areas of the lake bottom yield the best quality muck, rich in organic matter and free of excessive sand or clay. The first layer is perhaps 20 centimeters thick, enough to provide a growing medium, but not so much that it overwhelms the supporting mats. But before too much soil is added, the willow trees need to be planted. Young willow saplings are positioned at regular intervals along the edges of the chinampa, their roots placed to grow down through the soil and into the lake bottom. These trees are crucial for long-term stability. Their root systems will eventually tie the entire chinampa to the earth beneath, preventing it from floating away or breaking apart during storms. The willows also help stabilize the edges, reducing erosion from waves and passing boats. After the willows are planted, more soil is added, bringing the surface up to its final elevation about 20 to 30 centimeters above the normal water level. This height is carefully calculated. Too low and the chinampa will be waterlogged, making it difficult for crops to grow. Too high and it will dry out, losing the constant moisture that makes chinampa agriculture so productive. Getting the elevation right is both an art and a science, requiring experience and careful observation. The soil itself is a mixture of materials. The base layer is lakebed muck, incredibly rich in organic matter and nutrients, but pure muck would be too heavy and too water retentive. Farmers mix in lighter materials, decaying vegetation, partially decomposed reeds, sometimes ash from fires. This creates a lighter, more porous growing medium that drains well while retaining moisture and nutrients. It's essentially a giant compost heap, carefully engineered to provide the perfect growing environment for plants. What's remarkable about this construction process is that it requires no external materials. Everything needed to build a chinampa can be found in and around the lake itself. The reeds for the mats, the mud for the soil, the willows for anchoring, all of it comes from the local ecosystem. This means chinampa construction can be scaled up almost indefinitely without needing to import materials from outside the region. It's a self-contained system, entirely dependent on local resources. Construction continues even after the basic structure is complete. New chinampas need time to settle and stabilize. During this period, farmers might plant quick-growing cover crops to help hold the soil in place and begin the process of biological colonization. The roots of these plants help bind the soil together, and their decomposition adds organic matter. Microorganisms begin to colonize the new soil, initiating the biological processes that will make it fertile. The old man shows you a chinampa that was built recently, perhaps within the last year, and you can see how it differs from the mature plots you visited earlier. The soil is darker and more raw looking. The willows are still small, their root systems not yet fully developed, but even this young chinampa is productive, crops growing vigorously in the rich new soil. Within a few years, it will be indistinguishable from the older plots, another small rectangle of abundance floating on the lake. What you're witnessing is construction that's more like gardening than like building. A chinampa isn't assembled from pre-made components that are then locked into place. It's grown, developed gradually through biological processes as much as human labor. The willow roots grow down, the soil settles and consolidates, plants colonize and begin the cycles of growth and decay that create fertility. The human builder provides the framework and initial materials, but then natural processes take over, completing and maintaining the structure. This building process also reflects the chinampa system's ability to expand and contract over time. When the population grows and more food is needed, new chinampas can be created relatively quickly using established techniques. When population declines or land is needed for other purposes, chinampas can be allowed to return to the lake without leaving lasting scars on the landscape. It's a flexible system, capable of adapting to changing needs and conditions. As you watch the construction process unfold, you begin to understand why chinampa agriculture was so sustainable. Everything about it works with natural processes rather than against them. The building methods use locally available materials and don't disrupt the broader ecosystem. The resulting structures are biologically active, full of plants and microorganisms that maintain soil health, and the system as a whole creates a productive landscape that maintains rather than depletes fertility over time. The construction process also reveals something about the social organization of chinampa farming. Building a new chinampa requires coordinated labor people to weave mats, others to gather mud, others to plant willows. A single family couldn't easily manage all of this on their own. This suggests that chinampa communities developed systems of mutual aid and cooperative labor, with multiple families working together to create and maintain the agricultural landscape that supported them all. The chinampas might look like simple gardens floating on water, but what you're about to discover is that they're actually part of an extraordinarily sophisticated water management system. The old man poles his canoe through a network of canals, and as he goes, he begins to show you the complex hydrology that makes everything work. The water level in the canals isn't uniform. It varies systematically depending on the canal's function and location. Main transportation canals are kept deeper to allow larger boats to pass. Irrigation canals that deliver water to specific plots are shallower but carefully maintained to ensure consistent flow. And between the different areas of the chinampa system, there are controlled differences in water level that help manage everything from soil moisture to pest populations. The tool for managing all of this is deceptively simple. Sluice gates, made from woven reeds and wooden planks. These gates can be raised or lowered to control water flow between different sections of the canal system. Some are designed to maintain specific water levels, others to allow water to flow only in one direction, still others to completely isolate areas when necessary. The engineering is straightforward, but the understanding of water dynamics required to use these tools effectively is profound. Your guide demonstrates by navigating through a series of gates, each one adjusted to maintain the right water level for that section of the chinampas. He explains that water levels vary seasonally higher during the rainy season to accommodate increased flow, lower during the dry season to conserve water. But this isn't just about managing seasonal fluctuations. It's about creating microenvironments that support different crops and growing conditions. Some areas of the chinampa system are kept wetter than others, supporting crops that thrive in very moist conditions. Other areas are allowed to drain more thoroughly, perfect for crops that prefer drier soil. This fine-grained control over water conditions means that farmers can grow a wider variety of crops than would be possible with uniform water management. It's like having multiple different growing environments within a single overall system. The canals themselves serve multiple functions beyond irrigation and transportation. They're also nutrient cycling systems. As water flows through the canals, it carries dissolved nutrients from decomposing organic matter. These nutrients settle on the chinampa soils, gradually fertilizing them. The canals are also habitat for fish and aquatic plants, which contribute to the overall fertility through their waste and decomposition. Something else you notice: the water in different canals has different characteristics. Some canals are relatively clear, while others are tea-colored from tannins released by decaying vegetation. Some flow briskly, others are nearly still. These differences aren't accidental, they're managed to create specific conditions. Clear, flowing water might be preferred for canals used for drinking or washing, while still, nutrient-rich water might be directed toward areas where fertilization is the priority. The old man shows you how farmers test water quality using traditional methods, observing the color and clarity, smelling for any problematic odors, testing the feel of the water. This isn't scientific analysis in the modern sense, but it's based on generations of accumulated knowledge about what makes water suitable for different purposes. A farmer can tell at a glance whether water will be good for crops, safe to drink, or better used for irrigation elsewhere in the system. What's particularly clever is how the Chinampa system handles both flood and drought. During heavy rains, excess water can be directed into specific canals that serve as overflow channels, preventing the Chinampas from becoming waterlogged. These overflow canals connect to areas where the water can be stored or slowly released. During dry periods, water can be conserved by reducing flow and maintaining higher levels in storage canals. The system has resilience built into it, able to handle the extreme variability that characterizes the valley's climate. You also see evidence of biological water management plants that are deliberately encouraged or discouraged in certain canals. Some water plants help filter and purify water. Others fix nitrogen or provide habitat for beneficial organisms. Farmers carefully manage this vegetation, treating it as another component of the water management system rather than as random growth. It's a form of bioengineering, using living organisms to maintain water quality and fertility. The connection between the Chinampa system and the broader lake ecosystem is carefully managed too. Sluice gates control water exchange between the Chinampa canals and the main lake, preventing the brackish water of Lake Texcoco from contaminating the freshwater canals that feed the Chinampas. This separation of fresh and saline water was crucial for maintaining the productivity of the agricultural system, and managing it required sophisticated understanding of water dynamics. The old man brings the canoe to an area where you can see how used water is cycled back through the system. Water that has passed through irrigation canals, carrying nutrients from decomposing plants and other organic matter, eventually flows into areas where it can be filtered and reoxygenated before being reused. It's a circular system where water is continuously cleaned and renewed rather than used once and discarded. This circular approach dramatically increases the system's efficiency and reduces its environmental impact. What you're beginning to appreciate is that the Chinampas aren't just floating gardens, they're a water management technology as sophisticated as any modern irrigation system. The difference is that this technology is based on ecological principles rather than mechanical engineering, on working with natural processes rather than trying to control them through pumps and pipes. The result is a system that's both highly productive and remarkably sustainable. The hydrological management extends to soil moisture as well. Farmers can adjust the microclimate around their crops by controlling water levels in adjacent canals. Raising the water level increases humidity and reduces temperature swings, creating conditions that favor certain crops. Lowering the water level does the opposite. This fine-grained control over growing conditions allows farmers to extend growing seasons and cultivate crops that might not otherwise thrive in the regional climate. All of this water management requires coordination among the farmers who use the system. The water level in one canal affects conditions in neighboring areas. A decision made upstream has consequences downstream. This interdependence means that Chinampa communities develop systems of collective decision-making and conflict resolution, creating social institutions to manage the physical infrastructure. The hydrology and the social system co-evolved, each supporting and shaping the other. As the sun climbs toward midday, casting shadows across the intricate pattern of canals and plots, you find yourself marveling at the integrated nature of this system. Water, soil, plants, people, all woven together into a functioning whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. The Chinampas aren't just an agricultural technique, they're a way of life, a worldview expressed in landscape form, a testament to what humans can accomplish when they work with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them. The old man brings his canoe alongside a chinampa where a family is at work, and you're invited to step onto the soil and experience a day in the life of Chinampa farmers. What you discover is a rhythm of work that's attuned to natural cycles, a pattern of activities that's been refined over generations to maximize productivity while maintaining the long-term health of the land. The day begins before dawn, with farmers heading out to their chinampas in the cool morning hours. The mist still lies on the water, and the sounds are muffled and distant birds calling, water lapping against the banks, the quiet splash of poles in the canals. Early morning is prime time for harvesting, when crops are hydrated from the night's moisture and temperatures are cool enough that harvested produce won't wilt. You watch as the farmer, a man named Alejandro who works this plot with his wife and children, moves through his chinampa with practiced efficiency. He's harvesting tomatoes, and his hands move with a speed that comes from decades of practice. Each tomato is checked for ripeness with a quick glance and gentle squeeze, then twisted free with a motion that barely disturbs the plant. He drops them into a basket strapped to his back, the same kind of basket that his grandfather used, his great-grandfather before that. What's immediately apparent is that this isn't back-breaking labor in the way traditional farming can be. The soil is soft and yielding, easy to work without heavy tools. There's no plowing, no hard digging. The soil is so light and friable that plants can be inserted with a simple push of the finger. The farmer's movements are fluid and almost dance-like, the result of years of practice on this specific plot. Alejandro's wife, Maria, is working nearby on a different section of the chinampa. She's planting beans, carefully placing each seed at the base of a maize stalk where it can climb as it grows. The coordination between family members is unspoken but precise. Each person knows their tasks and moves through them without needing to discuss or coordinate. This is routine work, the kind that becomes meditation through repetition. The children have their age-appropriate tasks. The younger ones are weeding, pulling unwanted plants from between the rows. The older children are helping with the harvest, learning the techniques through observation and practice. There's no formal education in farming here, Children learn by working alongside their parents, absorbing knowledge through osmosis and imitation. By the time they're adults, farming techniques are encoded in their muscle memory, as natural as breathing. As the morning progresses, the sun rises higher and the temperature increases. This is the time for tasks that don't require direct exposure to the sun: maintenance work on the chinampa itself, tool repair, processing of harvested crops. Maria shows you how she checks soil moisture by feel, squeezing a handful of earth to assess its water content. Based on what she feels, she makes small adjustments to the water level in the adjacent canal using a simple sluice gate. Midday brings a break for the main meal of the day. The family gathers in a small shelter on one end of the chinampa, a simple structure of poles and thatch that provides shade and protection from rain. The meal is simple but nourishing: tortillas made from maize grown on this very chinampa, beans from another plot, salsa made from chilies and tomatoes harvested this morning. The food couldn't be more local, and the connection between work and sustenance is immediate and tangible. Afternoon work is different from morning tasks. The heat of the day makes heavy labor difficult, so this is the time for lighter activities: planting seedlings, checking for pests, making minor repairs to irrigation channels. Alejandro shows you how he checks the willow trees that anchor the chinampa, looking for signs of disease or damage. These trees are crucial for long-term stability, and maintaining them is part of the regular work cycle. Late afternoon brings cooler temperatures and a second wave of harvesting activity. Crops that were too warm to pick at midday are now ready, and the family moves through the chinampa again, gathering produce that will be sold at market or stored for home consumption. The work pace is steady but not frantic. There's a rhythm and flow that feels natural rather than forced. As evening approaches, the day's harvest is loaded into a canoe for transport to market or home. The old man who brought you here helps with this loading, and you watch as the basket after basket of produce is arranged in the canoe. It's an enormous amount of food from what seems like a very small piece of land, evidence of the extraordinary productivity of the chinampa system. But the workday isn't over when the harvesting is done. There are tools to clean and store, irrigation channels to check, preparations to make for tomorrow's work. The family works together to complete these final tasks, moving efficiently through the familiar routine. The children are tired but still engaged, learning that work has a beginning, middle, and end, that tasks, once started, should be completed. Evening brings a different pace. The sun sets behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors that reflect off the calm water. The sounds of the chinampa change as day turns to night: birds settling in the reeds, frogs beginning their evening chorus, the distant sounds of other families finishing their workday. It's a peaceful time, a transition between the activity of day and the rest of night. What strikes you about this day is how smoothly it flows. There's none of the stress or rush that characterizes so much modern work. The tasks follow natural rhythms, the rhythms of plants growing, of the sun moving across the sky, of the body's own cycles of energy and rest. The work is demanding but not exhausting, productive but not frantic. Alejandro explains that this kind of farming requires careful attention to small details. You have to notice how plants are growing, how the soil feels, how the water is moving. You have to be observant and responsive, making small adjustments constantly rather than waiting for problems to become obvious. This isn't farming by formula or calendar, it's farming by observation and response, by maintaining a constant dialogue with the land. You also notice the intergenerational nature of the work. Alejandro learned these techniques from his father, who learned them from his father, in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. His children are learning the same techniques through the same process of observation and practice. The chinampa isn't just a piece of land, it's a legacy, a connection to ancestors and descendants alike. Working this land means participating in a tradition that spans generations. As you prepare to leave the chinampa, you find yourself reflecting on how different this kind of agriculture is from the industrial farming that dominates much of the modern world. There's no heavy machinery, no chemical inputs, no monocropping stretching to the horizon. Instead, there's diversity, attention, and careful relationship with the land. The chinampas may be ancient, but they represent a kind of farming that many modern, sustainable agriculture advocates are trying to rediscover. The old man poles the canoe away from Alejandro's chinampa, and you watch the family continue their evening work. They're tired but content, moving through familiar tasks with the ease of long practice. This is hard work, certainly, but it's work that makes sense. Work that produces food while maintaining the land's capacity to continue producing. Work that connects people to place and to each other across generations. The old man navigates the canoe to a part of the chinampa system where you can see the incredible diversity of crops and the sophisticated rotation system that makes year-round production possible. What you're about to witness is the agricultural miracle that made the Valley of Mexico so productive. The ability to harvest crops continuously throughout the year, achieving up to 7 harvests annually from the same piece of land. In most agricultural systems, the growing season is limited by climate, by frost, by drought, by temperature extremes. Farmers get 1 or perhaps 2 harvests per year, and then they must wait or let their fields lie fallow to recover. But the chinampas operate on different principles. The constant moisture from the lake eliminates drought stress. The water's thermal mass moderates temperature extremes, protecting crops from both frost and excessive heat. The nutrient-rich soil means fertility never depletes. The result is a growing environment that can produce food year-round. Your guide shows you different plots, each at different stages of the growth cycle. On one chinampa, maize is just beginning to sprout, tiny green shoots emerging from the dark soil. On another, maize plants are tall and approaching maturity, their tassels waving in the breeze. On a third, the harvest is nearly complete, with dried stalks ready to be cleared and the soil prepared for replanting. This variation means that there's always something being harvested, always something being planted, always something growing toward maturity. What's particularly clever is how crops are rotated not just across seasons, but across space. Different plots are at different stages, creating a mosaic of growth stages across the chinampa system. This spreads risk if pests or disease affect one crop at one stage. Other crops at other stages may be unaffected. It also spreads labor more evenly, ensuring that there's work to do in every season rather than intense periods followed by fallow times. The old man explains that the rotation cycle is carefully planned. Some crops are quick growing, producing harvest in as little as 60 days. Others take longer but provide food later in the cycle. By mixing crops with different growth rates, farmers can harvest continuously rather than in discrete bursts. It's like planning a staggered meal service where different dishes are ready at different times, ensuring that food is always available. You see evidence of intercropping 2 different species growing together on the same plot, each with its own growth pattern and harvest time. The classic 3 sisters combination of maize, beans and squash is just the beginning. Farmers might add chilies, herbs or flowers to the mix, creating complex polycultures that produce multiple harvests from the same piece of land. Each species occupies a different niche, different root depth, different light requirements, different nutrient needs, so they don't compete directly, but instead complement each other. The constant harvesting doesn't mean constant planting of the same crops. Farmers rotate species not just to maintain soil fertility, but to match seasonal conditions. Some crops thrive in the cooler, dry season. Others prefer the warmer, rainy season. Some can tolerate occasional waterlogging. Others need better drainage. By matching crops to conditions, farmers can produce food year-round, regardless of seasonal variation. What's remarkable is that this continuous production doesn't seem to deplete the soil. In conventional agriculture, constant cropping would quickly exhaust soil fertility, requiring inputs of fertilizer or periods of fallow to recover. But the Chinampas have a built-in fertility renewal system. Farmers periodically add fresh lakebed muck to their plots, bringing in new nutrients and organic matter. Decomposing plant material from previous crops adds fertility. The canal water itself carries dissolved nutrients that constantly fertilize the soil. The old man shows you how farmers determine when to add fresh muck. It's not done on a fixed schedule, but in response to the condition of the soil and plants. Experienced farmers can look at a crop and tell whether it's getting adequate nutrition. They can feel the soil and assess its structure and fertility. This observational approach allows them to add inputs precisely when needed, maintaining optimal conditions without waste or over-fertilization. Something else you notice: the seeds used in chinampa farming are saved from previous harvests, not purchased new each year. Farmers select the best plants for seed saving, choosing those that performed well under local conditions. Over generations, this creates crop varieties that are perfectly adapted to the specific conditions of the chinampa environment, tolerant of the moisture levels, responsive to the nutrient availability, resistant to local pests and diseases. This is participatory plant breeding happening on a small scale, creating genetic resources that are uniquely suited to this place. The diversity of crops is staggering. You see multiple varieties of maize, different colors, different growth habits, different uses. Some varieties are best for fresh eating, others for drying and storage, still others for specific ceremonial purposes. Beans come in multiple varieties too, as do squashes, chilies, tomatoes. This diversity isn't just about culinary variety, it's about resilience. If one variety fails due to unusual conditions, others may succeed. Diversity is the chinampa farmer's insurance against uncertainty. The harvests aren't all used the same way either. Some crops are eaten fresh, others are processed for storage. Maize can be dried and kept for months. Beans can be stored dry. Squash can be preserved through drying or fermentation. This preservation capacity means that the abundance of the growing season can be spread throughout the year, providing food security even when production is lower. What you're witnessing is essentially a closed-loop agricultural system. The chinampas produce food, but they also produce the seeds needed for the next planting. Waste from crops becomes organic matter that feeds the soil. Water flows through the system and returns, purified and renewed. Energy comes from the sun and human labor rather than fossil fuels. It's a system that maintains rather than depletes, that regenerates rather than exhausts. The old man brings the canoe to a chinampa where a particularly impressive harvest is underway. The family working here is gathering maize, and the bounty is extraordinary ears filling basket after basket, far more than seems possible from the relatively small planting area. This is the miracle of 7 harvests made visible. Productivity that European farmers of the same period could barely comprehend, achieved through careful alignment with local conditions rather than attempts to override them. As you watch the harvest continue, you find yourself calculating in your head, if a single chinampa can produce this much maize, and there are thousands of chinampas, and they produce year-round, then the total food output must be enormous. This productivity is what made it possible for Tenochtitlan to support a population of hundreds of thousands at a time when European cities were a fraction of that size. The chinampas weren't just feeding people. They were enabling urbanization on a scale that wouldn't be seen in Europe for centuries. The canoe glides past chinampa after chinampa, and what becomes increasingly clear is the extraordinary diversity of crops being cultivated. This isn't monoculture farming where endless fields of a single crop stretch to the horizon. Instead, each chinampa contains multiple species, and the overall system supports an incredible variety of plants, food crops, medicinal plants, flowers, fibers, dyes. It's a polyculture system that produces not just calories but a complete range of human needs. The foundation of Chinampa agriculture is the Three Sisters combination: maize, beans, and squash. These 3 crops, developed together over thousands of years, form a mutually supporting guild. The maize provides a tall structure for the beans to climb. The beans fix atmospheric nitrogen, converting this gas into a form that plants can use, effectively fertilizing the soil. The squash spreads across the ground, its large leaves shading the soil to retain moisture and suppress weeds. Together, these 3 species produce more food and healthier soil than any single crop could alone. But the maize itself is diverse, not the single standardized yellow sweet corn that dominates modern agriculture. You see blue corn, red corn, white corn, each variety with different characteristics and uses. Blue corn is traditionally used for making talascali, the tortilla that's a staple food. Red corn might be preferred for certain dishes. White corn has yet other uses. This varietal diversity isn't just about culinary preference. It's about resilience and adaptation to different conditions. The beans are equally diverse. You see black beans, pinto beans, kidney beans, each climbing up maize stalks or growing along boundaries. Some varieties are quick growing, providing food early in the season. Others take longer but produce later, extending the harvest period. Some are best eaten fresh. Others are ideal for drying and storage. This temporal diversity spreads food production across the season rather than concentrating it in a single harvest window. The squashes represent another category of diversity. There are summer squashes harvested when immature and tender, winter squashes allowed to mature fully for storage, and various gourds grown for other purposes. The vines sprawl across the ground, their large leaves creating the shade that conserves moisture and protects the soil. Some varieties have edible flowers as well as fruit, providing yet another food source from the same plant. Beyond the Three Sisters, you see chilies growing everywhere, small hot peppers, larger mild peppers, varieties adapted to fresh eating and others meant for drying. Chilies aren't just food, they're medicine, providing vitamins and capsaicin compounds that have various health benefits. They're also preservatives, their antimicrobial properties helping stored food last longer, and they're cultural staples, essential components of the cuisine that defines this region. Tomatoes and tomatillos grow in abundance. They're plants supported by simple stakes or allowed to sprawl across the soil. You see both red tomatoes and green tomatillos, each used in different kinds of dishes. Some varieties are eaten fresh, others are cooked or processed. The diversity of uses matches the diversity of varieties, with each type selected for specific culinary purposes. Herbs and other flavoring plants are scattered throughout the Chinampas. Cilantro grows in the cooler microclimates. Epazote, with its distinctive flavor, grows in sunnier spots. Various kinds of onions and their relatives occupy different niches. These herbs aren't just garnishes, they're essential for creating flavors, and many have medicinal properties as well. The Chinampa system produces not just calories but a complete cuisine. But the diversity extends beyond food crops. You see Chinampas dedicated entirely to flowers, marigolds, zinnias, coxcomb, other blooms that have both aesthetic and practical uses. Marigolds, in particular, are grown extensively. Their bright orange and yellow flowers are used in religious ceremonies and celebrations. They also have pest-repelling properties, making them valuable companion plants for food crops. Some flowers are edible, used both as food and as garnish. Medicinal plants are cultivated too. You see various species with traditional healing uses plants for digestive problems, for wounds, for fevers, for reproductive health. The Chinampa system doesn't just produce food, it produces the pharmacy that traditional communities rely on for healthcare. This medical diversity represents another form of security, the knowledge that remedies for common ailments are growing right alongside the food. Fiber plants have their place in the Chinampas as well. Cotton for spinning and weaving, various plants used for making rope and twine, others that provide dye materials for coloring textiles and other goods. The Chinampas produce not just the raw materials for survival, but the materials for craft and commerce, for cultural expression and trade. What's particularly interesting is how plants are positioned within each Chinampa. Tall plants like maize go on the side where they won't shade shorter species. Shade-tolerant plants grow in the shadow of taller plants. Plants that need more moisture are positioned closer to the canal edges. Each plant is placed where conditions suit its needs, creating a three-dimensional arrangement that makes maximum use of available space and resources. The old man shows you how farmers use companion planting techniques that go beyond the three sisters. Some plants are grown together because they repel pests that might otherwise attack their companions. Others are paired because one plant's characteristics benefit another, perhaps providing shade, fixing nitrogen, or attracting beneficial insects. This companion planting is based on long observation and experimentation, refined over generations into a sophisticated plant guild system. What emerges is an understanding of the Chinampas as a diverse polyculture that produces a complete range of human needs. Food, medicine, fiber, dyes, ceremonial materials, it's all here, produced in an integrated system that maintains fertility and biodiversity rather than simplifying the landscape to a single crop. This diversity provides resilience too. If one crop fails due to unusual conditions or pest pressure, others may succeed, ensuring that the community doesn't face complete food insecurity. The diversity also has nutritional benefits. A varied diet provides all the essential nutrients, reducing the risk of deficiency diseases that often afflict populations dependent on a limited range of staple crops. The Chinampa diet, with its combination of maize, beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, and various other plants, provides complete protein, essential vitamins and minerals, and a rich array of phytochemicals that contribute to health. As you continue through the Chinampa system, you begin to appreciate that this isn't just farming, it's ecosystem engineering. The farmers have created a diverse, productive landscape that mimics natural ecosystems in its complexity, but exceeds them in its focused productivity. Everything serves multiple purposes. Everything is connected to everything else. It's a kind of agriculture that works with ecological principles rather than against them, creating abundance through diversity rather than simplification. The old man pauses the canoe beside a chinampa that's particularly diverse, containing what seems like dozens of different plant species all growing together in apparent harmony. It's a riot of colors and textures, a living demonstration of how much a small piece of land can produce when it's managed with skill and understanding. This single chinampa, no bigger than a suburban backyard, produces food, medicine, fiber, and flowers a complete range of human needs from a tiny footprint of land. As the day progresses, you begin to see more boats on the canal's farmers transporting their harvests to market. The old man guides his canoe to join this procession, and you experience the water highway system that moves produce from the Chinampas to the consumers who depend on it. The boats vary in size and design, but most follow the same basic pattern: long, narrow canoes carved from single tree trunks, propelled by poles rather than paddles. This design is perfectly adapted to the shallow canals. Poles can reach the bottom for efficient propulsion, whereas paddles would be less effective in the confined space. The boats are stable enough to carry substantial loads, but maneuverable enough to navigate the tight turns and narrow passages of the canal network. You fall in behind a canoe loaded with maize, the ears piled high in an enormous basket. The farmer poling this boat moves with practiced ease, his motion rhythmic and efficient. He's been making this trip regularly for decades, and every bend in the canal, every sluice gate, every tricky current is familiar. He doesn't need to think about navigation. It's encoded in muscle memory, as natural as breathing. The waterborne transportation system has enormous advantages over overland transport. A canoe can carry loads that would require multiple people to move on land. The water provides most of the support for the weight, meaning that propelling a heavily loaded boat doesn't require significantly more effort than propelling an empty one. And the canals provide direct routes from the Chinampas to markets, bypassing the rough terrain that would make land transport difficult. As you move through the canal network, you see how the transportation routes are organized. Smaller canals feed into larger ones, which in turn connect to main transportation arteries. It's a hierarchical system, much like a network of roads feeding into highways. The main canals are wider and deeper, capable of accommodating larger boats and heavier loads. Smaller canals provide access to individual chinampas or small clusters of plots. Everything connects, everything flows toward the market centers. The old man explains that transportation is carefully coordinated. Farmers whose produce is destined for market try to time their departures to arrive together, creating small convoys that travel together rather than individually. There's safety in numbers, and there's also efficiency. Multiple boats can pass through a sluice gate or narrow passage more easily than the same number of boats traveling separately. You notice that the boats are loaded with incredible care and skill. The baskets are packed precisely, with heavier items on the bottom and more delicate produce on top. Everything is secured to prevent shifting during transit. The loading itself is an art, developed through experience how to maximize the load while maintaining the boat's stability and the produce's quality. Different kinds of produce require different handling. Delicate items like tomatoes are packed in smaller quantities and given more cushioning. Hardy items like squash can be stacked more densely. Some produce is still attached to plants, keeping it fresh longer. Other items are harvested and processed before transport, dried, sorted, or otherwise prepared to withstand the journey. Everything is done with a specific market and its customers in mind. As you travel, you pass boats heading the opposite direction, some returning empty after deliveries, others bringing supplies back from the market. The canals carry two-way traffic, and there are conventions about right-of-way, about passing in narrow channels, about signaling intentions. It's a marine traffic system developed through long experience, governing the interactions of multiple boats moving in limited space. The journey from Chinampas to market gives you a different perspective on the scale of the system. You pass mile after mile of productive gardens, thousands of individual plots, all contributing to the food supply. The extent is staggering when you're on a single chinampa. It's hard to appreciate how vast the overall system is, but from the canals, you begin to grasp the enormous scale of chinampa agriculture. You also see the social dimension of transportation. Farmers traveling together chat and share news. Information flows as readily as produce, with word of market prices, weather forecasts, and community events passing from boat to boat. The transportation network is also a communication network, keeping the Chinampa community connected and informed. The old man brings the canoe to a wider canal where the traffic is denser. Here you see boats of different sizes, from small individual canoes like yours to larger vessels carrying substantial commercial loads. Some boats are specialized certain designs for bulk cargo like maize, others for more delicate items, still others for passengers. The diversity of boat types reflects the diversity of goods being moved and the different scales of operation. What's particularly impressive is the efficiency of the whole system. There's no wasted movement, no unnecessary backtracking. The canals provide direct routes from production areas to markets. The boats are perfectly adapted to their environment. The loading and handling techniques minimize damage to produce. Everything has been optimized over generations to move food from where it's grown to where it's needed, with minimal loss and maximum efficiency. As you approach the market area, the canal traffic becomes denser and more diverse. You see boats not just from Xochimilco, but from other Chinampa regions around the valley, each bringing their own specialties. The water transportation network connects all the productive areas of the valley, making it possible to move surplus food from where it's abundant to where it's needed, balancing supply and demand across the region. The journey has taken perhaps an hour or two, covering what would have been a much longer and more difficult trip overland. And this is just one run, one farmer making one delivery. Across the Chinampa system, thousands of similar journeys are happening every day, moving food from thousands of small plots to hundreds of thousands of consumers. It's a transportation system that makes urban life possible, connecting rural production with urban consumption in a constant flow of nutrients and calories. The old man steers the canoe toward a dock where boats are unloading, and you prepare to see what happens to all this produce when it reaches its destination. The transportation leg of the journey is ending, but the food's movement from producer to consumer is just one part of a larger economic system that links Chinampa farmers with the urban population of Tenochtitlan. The canoe docks at Tlatelolco, and you step onto land that was once the site of the largest market in the Americas, possibly the largest market anywhere in the world at the time. What you're about to witness is the commercial heart of the Aztec Empire, the place where Chinampa produce fed hundreds of thousands of urban dwellers every day. The market of Tlatelolco was so enormous that Spanish conquistadors, when they first saw it, could barely believe their eyes. They wrote of being overwhelmed by the size, the variety, the organized chaos of thousands of buyers and sellers conducting business. And while the Spanish destroyed much of Tenochtitlan, the memory of Tlatelolco's market survives in their accounts, a testament to the scale and sophistication of Aztec commerce. Walking through the reconstructed market area, you can imagine how it must have looked. The space was organized by product type, with specific areas dedicated to different kinds of goods. One section for maize, another for beans, another for squash. Specialized areas for chilies, tomatoes, flowers, sections for prepared foods, for tools, for craft goods. The organization made it easy for buyers to find what they needed and for sellers to connect with their customers. The scale is hard to comprehend. Modern estimates suggest that the market served a population of 200,000 to 300,000 people in Tenochtitlan alone, with additional customers coming from surrounding areas. Feeding that many people required an enormous daily flow of food, and the chinampas were the primary source. Every day, thousands of boats and porters brought produce to market, and every day, that produce was purchased and consumed. What's particularly remarkable is how this market functioned without currency. The Aztecs used cacao beans and quatli, cotton cloth, as media of exchange. But much trade happened through direct barter, exchanging goods for goods rather than for money. This required a shared understanding of relative values, a complex system of equivalences that allowed Chinampa farmers to trade their produce for everything they needed. The old man shows you where different kinds of produce would have been sold. The maize section alone would have been enormous, with multiple varieties available at different prices depending on quality and intended use. Beans, squash, chilies, each major crop had its own area, with multiple vendors competing for customers. This competition helped regulate prices and ensured quality, as sellers with inferior products or unfair prices would lose business to competitors. But the market wasn't just about raw agricultural produce. There were also areas for prepared foods, tortillas made fresh from maize, tamales wrapped in corn husks, pozole, and other stews. The market fed people who didn't have time or facilities to cook, providing the equivalent of modern fast food, but with traditional dishes prepared fresh daily. This prepared food sector represented an important processing step, turning raw Chinampa produce into meals ready to eat. What's also striking is the specialization of vendors. Some sellers focused on specific products, perhaps one variety of chili or one type of flour. Others specialized in quality grades, selling premium produce to wealthier customers while offering more affordable options to those with limited means. This specialization reflected the diversity of Chinampa production and the range of consumer needs and budgets. The market also had a regulatory system. Judges appointed by the Kalpalek, local leaders, monitored transactions, settled disputes, and enforced standards. Weights and measures were standardized to prevent fraud. Rules about quality and fair dealing were enforced. This wasn't an unregulated free-for-all, but a carefully managed commercial space with established rules and institutions. The old man explains that market day followed a predictable rhythm. Vendors arrived early to set up their stalls, often spending the night before in travel to be ready for the morning business. The peak activity came in the mid-morning to early afternoon, when customers were most numerous. Late afternoon saw tapering business as vendors began packing up unsold goods and preparing for the return journey or the next market day. Something else you notice: the market wasn't just a place of economic exchange, but also a social space. People came not just to buy and sell, but to socialize, to exchange news and gossip, to participate in the community's social life. The market was where you met friends, heard about important events, conducted courtship, and maintained social connections. It was the community's public square in every sense. The diversity of goods available at Tlatelolco went far beyond Chinampa produce. Craft items from across the empire were available: obsidian tools from the north, tropical feathers from the south, textiles from different regions, with distinctive patterns and techniques. But agricultural products from the Chinampas formed the foundation of the market economy, the staple goods that everyone needed and that accounted for the majority of transactions by volume. The market also served a redistribution function. Surplus production from the Chinampas could be sold here, generating income for farmers while feeding the urban population. The market mechanism allocated food to those who needed it, with prices signaling scarcity and abundance. When Chinampa production was high, prices fell, making food accessible to more people. When production was constrained by drought or other problems, prices rose, rationing limited supply through the price mechanism. The old man shows you where the market administrators had their offices. These officials recorded transactions, collected taxes, typically a portion of sales, and maintained order. The market generated substantial revenue for the Aztec state, which used it to support the government, military, and public works. The Chinampa farmers, through their market sales, were essentially funding the empire that protected and governed them. What's particularly impressive is the logistical sophistication required to make a market this size function. Every day, enormous quantities of perishable produce had to arrive at the market, be displayed and sold, and then distributed to consumers, all without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques. This required careful coordination between production, transportation, and consumption, with the market serving as the central coordinating mechanism. The market also played a role in food security. Surplus production during good times could be sold and, through the market mechanism, distributed more broadly. During shortages, the market's price signals would encourage conservation and redistribution of available food. The market wasn't perfect. Poor people could be priced out during real shortages, but it provided a flexible mechanism for balancing supply and demand that worked most of the time. As you stand in the space that was once Tlatelolco's great market, you begin to understand how the Chinampas and the market formed a system. The Chinampas produced the food surplus that made urban life possible. The market allocated that surplus to the urban population and provided income for Chinampa farmers. The two were interdependent, each enabling the other. Neither could have functioned without the other. The market also connected the Chinampas to the broader economy. Farmers could use their market earnings to purchase goods and services they couldn't produce themselves: tools, craft items, luxury goods. The market was the interface between the agricultural sector and the rest of the economy, allowing specialization and exchange that made everyone better off. The old man prepares to leave the market area, and you take one last look at the space where thousands of people once gathered daily to buy and sell the produce of the Chinampas. The market is gone now, destroyed by the Spanish and built over by the expanding city. But in memory and in historical records, Tlatelolco remains a testament to the sophistication of Aztec commerce and the vital role that Chinampa agriculture played in feeding one of the largest cities in the pre-modern world. Leaving the market behind, the old man poles his canoe back into the Chinampa zone, and you're about to learn how the social organization of Chinampa communities made this whole system work. Because what you've been witnessing isn't just agricultural technology, it's a social system, a way of organizing human activity that makes the physical infrastructure possible. Chinampa agriculture is fundamentally small-scale. Each plot is worked by a single family, and the size of the plot is carefully calibrated to what one family can manage. But while individual chinampas are small and family-run, the overall system requires coordination at a much larger scale. The water that flows through your chinampa comes from and goes to your neighbor's plot. The sluice gate you operate affects water levels for everyone in your area. The crops you plant can cross-pollinate with or spread pests to your neighbor's gardens. This interdependence means that chinampa farming can't be done in isolation. It requires community. The basic unit of social organization is the kalpuli, a group of related families who collectively use and manage a set of chinampas. The kalpuli owns the land communally, though individual families have use rights to specific plots. These use rights are hereditary, but not absolute. The community can reallocate land if families die out or if circumstances change. It's a system that balances individual stewardship with collective control. Within the kalpuli, decisions about land use, water management, and crop selection are made collectively. The heads of households meet regularly to discuss issues and make decisions. Some decisions require consensus. Others are made by majority vote or by recognized leaders. The system isn't perfectly democratic. There are status differences and power imbalances, but it does provide mechanisms for collective decision-making and conflict resolution. The old man shows you an area where multiple kalpuli meet, and you can see the physical evidence of social organization. The canals that form the boundaries between different kalpuli territories are maintained collectively, with each group responsible for sections that border their land. There are common areas for shared activities, places where boats are docked, where produce is gathered for market, where meetings are held. The physical infrastructure reflects and supports the social organization. Labor exchange is crucial to the system. Some tasks require more labor than a single family can provide: building a new chinampa, repairing major canal damage, harvesting large crops. For these tasks, families within the kalpuli, and sometimes across multiple kalpuli, organize work parties where people contribute labor in exchange for the promise of reciprocal help when they need it. This system of mutual aid, known as tekio, ensures that large tasks get done without requiring hired labor or coercion. What's particularly interesting is how knowledge is organized and transmitted. Chinampa farming requires complex knowledge about water management, soil fertility, crop rotations, pest control. This knowledge isn't written down in books or manuals. It's encoded in practice, passed from generation to generation through apprenticeship and observation. Elders are respected not just for their age but for their knowledge, and the transmission of this knowledge to younger generations is a crucial social function. The old man introduces you to an elder who's recognized as a master of chinampa techniques. This man, Don Felipe, can tell at a glance whether soil is healthy, whether water levels are right, whether a plant is getting adequate nutrition. He can predict weather changes by observing wind patterns and cloud formations. He knows the traditional varieties of each crop and their specific characteristics. His knowledge isn't scientific in the modern sense, but it's extraordinarily sophisticated and effective. But Don Felipe is humble about his expertise. He explains that he learned from his father, who learned from his father, in a chain of knowledge transmission that stretches back countless generations. He sees himself not as an inventor of techniques, but as a custodian of inherited wisdom. His responsibility is to use this knowledge wisely and to pass it on to the next generation intact. Social organization also extends to resource management. The Calpulli has rules about water use, when people can draw from certain canals, how much they can take, what happens during droughts. There are rules about fishing and hunting in shared areas. There are rules about waste disposal and pollution. These rules aren't written in formal codes, but are understood and enforced through social pressure and collective decision-making. Conflict resolution mechanisms exist too. When disputes arise between families over water access, boundary lines, or other issues, there are established procedures for addressing them. Elders may mediate. The Calpulli leadership may make decisions. In extreme cases, disputes might be escalated to higher authorities, but most conflicts are resolved locally, using mechanisms that have been developed and refined over generations. The Chinampa system also has mechanisms for accommodating population change. When families grow and need more land, the Calpulli may authorize the creation of new Chinampas in undeveloped areas of the lake. When population declines and land falls idle, the Calpulli may redistribute plots to maintain productivity. This flexibility allows the system to adapt to demographic change while maintaining the balance between population and productive capacity. What's particularly striking is how the social organization mirrors the ecological principles of the Chinampa system. Just as the physical system is diverse, interconnected, and self-renewing, so is the social system. Different families and Calpulli have different specialties and roles, but they're all interconnected through shared resources and mutual dependencies. Knowledge is constantly being renewed through transmission to new generations. The system adapts to change while maintaining continuity with tradition. The old man explains that this social organization didn't emerge spontaneously. It developed over centuries, through trial and error, as communities figured out what worked and what didn't. The current system represents accumulated wisdom about how to organize human activity to manage a complex ecological resource. It's social engineering that's as sophisticated as the physical engineering of the Chinampas themselves. As you prepare to leave this area, you find yourself reflecting on how different this social organization is from modern capitalist agriculture. Chinampa farming isn't about individual profit maximization or competition in anonymous markets. It's about community stewardship of shared resources, about mutual aid and collective decision-making, about balancing individual needs with communal welfare. It's a different way of organizing economic activity, one that has sustained this landscape for centuries. The social system has its problems and tensions, certainly inequalities of power and status, conflicts over resources, challenges to maintaining traditional practices in a changing world. But it has also demonstrated remarkable resilience, surviving conquest, colonization, and modernization while maintaining core principles and practices. The Chinampas are still productive today, because the social systems that support them have also endured. The old man poles the canoe toward an area where you can see one of the great engineering achievements of the Chinampa system. The dike built by Nezahualcoyotl, the Texcocan ruler who devised a solution to the valley's perpetual flooding problems. What you're about to witness is hydraulic engineering on a massive scale infrastructure that made it possible for the Chinampas to thrive while protecting them from the destructive forces of nature. To understand the dike, you first need to understand the problem it was designed to solve. The Valley of Mexico's lake system was naturally unstable. During the rainy season, enormous quantities of water would pour into the closed basin, with no outlet to the sea. Lake Texcoco, the largest of the 5 lakes, would expand dramatically, flooding surrounding areas including the Chinampa zones of Xochimilco and Chalco. These floods could destroy crops, drown Chinampas, and wipe out months or years of agricultural work in a single event. The dike that Nezahualcoyotl built was essentially a wall across Lake Texcoco, dividing it into two separate bodies of water. The eastern section, which received the brunt of the freshwater inflows, could rise without flooding the western section and the Chinampa zones. The western section, which was saltier and more brackish, was kept at a lower level that protected the valuable agricultural areas around it. It was a solution of elegant simplicity, create a barrier that allows differential water levels on either side. But the dike was more than just a simple wall. It incorporated sluice gates that could be opened or closed as needed. During normal conditions, these gates allowed controlled water exchange between the two sides of the lake, maintaining appropriate levels and salinity in each section. During flood conditions, the gates could be closed to isolate the sections completely, preventing floodwaters from reaching vulnerable areas. When flooding subsided, the gates could be gradually reopened to restore normal conditions. The oldman shows you how the dike was constructed. It wasn't built from stone or earth alone, but from a combination of materials. The core was made of compacted earth and rubble, providing mass and stability. This core was faced with stone on both sides, protecting it from erosion. The top of the dike was wide enough to serve as a causeway, allowing people to cross from one side of the lake to the other, and the sluice gates were made from carefully fitted stone with wooden barriers that could be raised or lowered as needed. What's particularly impressive is that this was built without modern engineering tools or techniques. There were no surveying instruments to precisely establish elevations, no hydraulic models to predict water flows, no mechanical equipment to move construction materials. Everything was done by hand labor, guided by empirical knowledge and careful observation. The result was a piece of infrastructure that served its function effectively for centuries. The dike also had to handle the particular challenges of building in water. Construction couldn't simply begin on dry ground. The dike had to be built across the lake, starting from both shores and meeting in the middle. This required sophisticated understanding of how to work in water, how to create temporary cofferdams to keep work areas dry, how to position and secure construction materials in wet conditions, how to ensure that the finished structure would be stable and watertight. The old man explains that the dike system required constant maintenance. The gates had to be operated by skilled workers who understood when and how to adjust them. The structure itself needed regular inspection and repair, especially after extreme weather events. The earthen core could settle over time, requiring additional material to maintain the proper height and width. The stone facing could be damaged by waves or ice, requiring replacement or reinforcement. This maintenance wasn't an afterthought. It was built into the social organization of the region. Communities near the dike had specific responsibilities for its upkeep. There were officials whose job was to monitor the dike's condition and supervise repairs. Workers were assigned to maintain the gates and operate them as needed. The social systems that maintained the Chinampas also maintained the infrastructure that protected them. What's also clever about the dike system is how it worked with the Chinampa water management rather than against it. The dike controlled the overall water level of the lake system, but the Chinampas had their own sophisticated water management at the micro scale. The two systems complemented each other, with the dike preventing catastrophic flooding while the Chinampa canals and sluice gates managed fine-grained water control for individual plots. The dike also served another crucial function, separating fresh water from brackish. Lake Texcoco was salty due to evaporation in the closed basin, and salt water would kill the crops grown on the Chinampas. By maintaining a lower water level on the saltwater side and a higher level on the freshwater side, The dike created a hydraulic barrier that prevented salt water from intruding into the Chinampa zones. This freshwater management was essential for making Chinampa agriculture possible. The old man shows you how this freshwater management actually worked. The Chinampa zones in Xochimilco and Chalco were fed by springs and freshwater streams, creating essentially freshwater lakes even as the main body of Lake Texcoco remained salty. The dike prevented the salt water from mixing with this fresh water, preserving the conditions that the Chinampas required. It was a delicate balance, maintained through careful management of water levels and flows. What's remarkable about this whole system is how it was developed through empirical observation and experimentation rather than through theoretical engineering. Nezahualcoyotl and his advisors didn't have hydrological models or floodplain maps. They had generations of accumulated knowledge about how the lakes behaved, about seasonal patterns, about the effects of different interventions. They used this knowledge to design a solution that worked with the natural behavior of the system, rather than trying to completely control it. The dike system also demonstrates the scale of political organization possible in the Aztec world. Building infrastructure on this scale required coordinating labor across multiple communities, directing resources toward a common goal, and maintaining the structure over time. This kind of large-scale collective action was only possible through the sophisticated political institutions that the Aztecs and their neighbors had developed. As you examine the remains of the dike, you begin to appreciate how the Chinampa system wasn't just about the gardens themselves, but about the entire engineered landscape that made them possible. The Chinampas, the canals, the dikes, the water control systems, all of it formed an integrated whole that managed the valley's hydrology to support agricultural abundance. Removing any piece of this system would compromise the whole. The old man explains that the Spanish, when they arrived, neither understood nor appreciated this hydraulic engineering. They saw the dikes and water control systems, but they didn't comprehend their purpose or their sophisticated design. After the conquest, they allowed the dikes to fall into disrepair, with catastrophic results. Without the dike system, major floods returned, devastating the Chinampa zones and reducing their productivity dramatically. This is a bitter irony. The Spanish destroyed what they didn't understand, and in doing so, they created problems that continue to plague Mexico City to this day. The city still faces serious flooding issues, problems that were solved centuries ago by indigenous engineers whose techniques have been lost or forgotten. The Chinampa system that survives today is a shadow of its former self, partly because the protective infrastructure is gone. As the old man poles the canoe away from the dike, you find yourself reflecting on the relationship between knowledge and power. The Aztecs and their neighbors had developed sophisticated understanding of their environment and the engineering to manage it. The Spanish had military and technological superiority in other domains, but they lacked the specific local knowledge that made life in this valley sustainable. In the collision between these different knowledge systems, the local knowledge was lost, and with it went capabilities that we're only now beginning to appreciate. The old man navigates the canoe to a quiet area of the Chinampa zone, and here the mood shifts. He's about to tell you about the events that mark the great tragedy of this story, the arrival of the Spanish and the destruction that followed. What you're about to hear is how one of the world's most sophisticated agricultural systems was nearly lost through incomprehension and greed. When Hernán Cortés and his soldiers first entered the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they encountered a civilization that astonished them. Tenochtitlan was larger than any city they had seen in the Americas, larger than most European cities of the time. The chinampas that fed the city were like nothing they had ever seen, gardens that floated on water, producing food in quantities that European agriculture couldn't match. The Spanish were impressed, but also baffled. They couldn't comprehend how this system worked, and they certainly couldn't appreciate its sophistication. The initial Spanish reaction was curiosity mixed with opportunism. Cortés saw the potential of the Chinampas, but also the potential for conquest. The Aztec Empire was wealthy and powerful, and control of its agricultural base meant control of its resources. The Spanish began making alliances with groups that were subject to Aztec rule, exploiting existing political tensions to undermine Moctezuma's power. The turning point came with the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, when the Aztecs finally rebelled against Spanish occupation and drove Cortés and his allies out of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish escaped, but they left behind destruction and disease. Smallpox, unknown in the Americas, swept through the indigenous population with devastating effect. The epidemic killed enormous numbers of people, including possibly Moctezuma himself, and fatally weakened Aztec resistance. When Cortés returned with reinforcements and besieged Tenochtitlan, the Chinampas became a battlefield. The Spanish and their indigenous allies built warships to control the lakes, cutting off the city's access to the Chinampa food supply. The Aztecs resisted fiercely, but the combination of military pressure, starvation, and disease was too much. After 93 days of siege, Tenochtitlan fell, and with it fell the Aztec Empire. But the destruction didn't end with military conquest. The Spanish began a systematic process of dismantling Aztec civilization. Buildings were torn down, and their stones used for Spanish construction. The Great Temple was demolished, and a cathedral built on its site. The Chinampa system, while not destroyed outright, was profoundly disrupted. The social organization that maintained it, the Calpulli, the systems of mutual aid and collective decision-making, was undermined by Spanish political and religious authorities. What the Spanish didn't understand, they tried to replace. They saw the Chinampas as interesting but primitive, a technique to be improved upon rather than learned from. They introduced European farming methods, European crops, European concepts of land ownership. They tried to remake the valley in the image of the Spanish countryside, with disastrous results. European crops often failed in the valley's conditions. European ploughing techniques destroyed the delicate soil structure of the Chinampas. European concepts of individual land ownership disrupted the communal systems that had managed the Chinampas for centuries. The population collapse also affected the Chinampa system. Disease killed an estimated 80% of the indigenous population in the decades after conquest. With so few people left, much of the Chinampa area was abandoned. The labor-intensive maintenance that the system required couldn't be sustained. Canals filled in, dikes broke down, Chinampas eroded away or were overrun by invasive vegetation. The physical infrastructure remained, but without the human infrastructure to maintain it, the system began to fail. The Spanish also made changes to the valley's hydrology that further damaged the Chinampas. They saw the lakes as obstacles to development rather than as resources to be managed. Over the centuries that followed, they began draining the lakes, filling in wetlands, and altering water flows. The dike system that Nezahualcóyotl had built was allowed to deteriorate. Without flood control, periodic inundations devastated the remaining Chinampas. Without freshwater management, salt water intruded into areas that had been productive freshwater gardens. What's particularly tragic is that the Spanish never really understood what they were destroying. They saw the surface of the Chinampa system, the floating gardens, the canals, the abundant harvests, but they didn't grasp the sophisticated understanding of ecology and hydrology that made it all possible. They destroyed knowledge accumulated over centuries, replacing it with techniques that were less effective and less sustainable. In the name of progress, they created regression. The old man's voice carries bitterness as he tells this story. For him, as for many indigenous people in Mexico, the conquest isn't ancient history, but living memory. His family has been working chinampas for generations, and each generation has had to adapt to changing conditions and declining resources. The techniques have survived, but the context in which they flourished is gone. But what's remarkable is that anything survived at all. Despite conquest, disease, persecution, and environmental degradation, the Chinampa system wasn't completely lost. In Xochimilco and Chalco, farmers continued using traditional techniques, adapting to changing conditions while preserving core principles. They maintained the knowledge encoded in practice, passing it from generation to generation, even as the world changed around them. The survival of the Chinampas is a testament to indigenous resilience and the value of traditional knowledge. The Spanish tried to replace indigenous techniques with European ones, but where indigenous methods survived, they often outperformed the imports. The Chinampas continued to produce food when European-style farms in the valley were failing. They continued to support communities when other systems were collapsing. This quiet efficacy is the best argument for the value of traditional knowledge. As the old man finishes his story, you're struck by the enormity of what was lost. The Chinampa system at its peak fed hundreds of thousands of people, using techniques that were sustainable, productive, and beautifully adapted to local conditions. What remains today is a fragment, a shadow of what once existed. But even this fragment is impressive enough to suggest the scale of what was lost. The Spanish destroyed what they couldn't understand, but they couldn't completely destroy the knowledge that lived in practice and in memory. The Chinampas survived because farmers kept using them, kept passing down techniques, kept adapting to new circumstances while staying true to core principles. This survival is a form of resistance, a refusal to let indigenous knowledge disappear completely. The old man poles the canoe toward an area of Xochimilco where Chinampas are still actively farmed today, and what you witness is both inspiring and heartbreaking. The techniques have survived, the basic methods are still practiced, but the context has changed dramatically. What you're seeing is a remnant of a once great system, struggling to survive in a world that's largely forgotten its value. The surviving Chinampas are clustered in the southern part of what was once Lake Xochimilco. Much of the original lake has been drained or filled in. The water that remains is polluted from urban runoff and wastewater treatment. The canals are clogged with invasive species, and yet, in the midst of this degradation, farmers continue to work their plots, using techniques that would be familiar to their ancestors from centuries ago. You pass a Chinampa where an older farmer is working, and the techniques are recognizably traditional. He's using a wooden tool to carefully transplant seedlings, working the soil with a gentleness that reflects its fragility. He checks the water level in the adjacent canal and makes a small adjustment to a sluice gate. The details are different modern clothes, a plastic bucket instead of a woven basket, but the core practices are unchanged. The old man introduces you to this farmer, Doña Carmen, who has been working this Chinampa for over 50 years, just as her parents and grandparents did before her. She shows you her crops: maize, beans, squash, chilies, grown in combinations that would be familiar to farmers from centuries ago. She explains which varieties she's growing and why, demonstrating knowledge that has been refined over generations but remains fundamentally traditional. But Doña Carmen also talks about the challenges she faces. The water quality is poor, affected by pollution from the growing city. Some crops don't grow well in the degraded conditions. Pests and diseases are more common, perhaps due to ecological imbalances. The market for traditional chinampa products is limited, with many consumers preferring cheaper industrial produce. And there's constant pressure from developers who would like to drain the remaining chinampas and build on the land. Despite these challenges, Doña Carmen keeps farming. She talks about the chinampa not just as a piece of land, but as a legacy, a connection to her ancestors, and a responsibility to her descendants. The techniques she uses aren't just methods of producing food, they're a cultural tradition that she feels obligated to preserve. Farming this chinampa is an act of resistance against cultural erasure, a way of maintaining indigenous identity in a world that often values homogeneity over diversity. The old man explains that the surviving chinampa farmers have formed organizations to advocate for their interests and to preserve their traditional knowledge. They've developed adaptations to modern conditions, new varieties that tolerate polluted water, organic techniques for dealing with pests, direct marketing strategies to reach consumers who value traditional products. These adaptations show the continued evolution of chinampa agriculture, responding to new challenges while staying true to core principles. What's particularly encouraging is that there's renewed interest in chinampa agriculture from unexpected quarters. Environmental activists have recognized the value of the chinampas as a sustainable food system. Researchers are studying traditional techniques, looking for lessons that can be applied to modern agriculture. Tourists come to see the floating gardens, bringing income and attention to the area. The chinampas, once dismissed as primitive, are now being recognized as sophisticated and potentially instructive. The Mexican government has declared parts of Xochimilco a protected area and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These designations bring resources and attention, though they also create tensions. Protection can limit farmers' ability to adapt to changing conditions. Tourism can bring income, but can also disrupt traditional practices. There are no easy solutions, but at least there's recognition that what remains is worth preserving. Doña Carmen shows you some of the adaptations she's made. She's growing flowers as well as food crops, responding to market demand from Mexico City for traditional flowers used in Day of the Dead celebrations. She's using organic certification to access premium markets that value traditional techniques. She's experimenting with new crop varieties while maintaining the traditional polyculture approach. These adaptations show how chinampa agriculture continues to evolve while staying rooted in tradition. The old man explains that some young people are returning to chinampa farming, drawn by the cultural connection and by economic opportunities in organic and traditional agriculture. This reversal of the earlier trend of youth leaving agriculture offers hope for the chinampas' future. These young farmers bring new ideas and new energy while learning from their elders, creating a fusion of tradition and innovation. You notice that the surviving chinampas aren't just producing food, they're maintaining biodiversity. The traditional crop varieties grown here are genetic resources that have largely disappeared from industrial agriculture. The chinampa landscape provides habitat for birds and other wildlife that have been displaced from other parts of the valley. In preserving traditional agriculture, these farmers are also preserving ecological diversity that might otherwise be lost. As you prepare to leave the working chinampas, Doña Carmen gives you a gift, a small bundle of traditional maize seeds from her plot. It's a simple gesture, but it carries enormous symbolic weight. These seeds represent the continuity of tradition, the survival of knowledge, the hope for the future. The techniques embodied in these seeds have survived conquest, colonization, and modernization. They continue to produce food and to carry cultural meaning. The old man poles the canoe away from the active chinampas, and you reflect on what you've seen. What survives today is a fragment, certainly, but a living fragment rather than a fossil. The chinampas continue to evolve, responding to new challenges while maintaining core principles. They demonstrate the resilience of traditional knowledge and the value of techniques developed through long observation and experimentation. Perhaps most importantly, the surviving chinampas offer a different model of agriculture, small-scale, diverse, working with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them. In a world facing environmental crisis and food security challenges, this model may have important lessons to teach us. The chinampas aren't just historical curiosities, they're potential sources of solutions to contemporary problems. As the sun begins to set over the remaining chinampas, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that must have illuminated these waters centuries ago, you feel a sense of both loss and hope. Much has been destroyed, yes, but something precious survives, and in that survival is the possibility of renewal, the chance that traditional knowledge might help address modern challenges. The canoe journey is coming to an end, and as the old man poles back toward the dock where you started, you find yourself reflecting on everything you've seen and learned. The chinampas are more than just an ancient agricultural technique. They're a different way of thinking about the relationship between humans and the environment, between production and sustainability, between tradition and innovation. The most obvious lesson is about working with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them. Modern industrial agriculture often treats nature as an obstacle to be overcome. Soil is a substrate for chemical inputs. Water is a resource to be exploited. Pests are enemies to be eradicated. The Chinampa approach treats nature as a partner. Soil fertility is maintained through natural processes. Water is managed through understanding hydrological cycles. Pests are controlled through biodiversity and crop rotation. The result is an agricultural system that maintains rather than depletes, that regenerates rather than exhausts. But there's a deeper lesson too, the importance of accumulated local knowledge. The Chinampas weren't designed by scientists or engineers working from first principles. They emerged over centuries through careful observation, experimentation, and knowledge transmission. Each generation added to what they inherited, gradually refining techniques to match local conditions. This slow, patient approach created solutions that were exquisitely adapted to specific places and problems, something that standardized, one-size-fits-all approaches can never achieve. The Chinampas also teach us about the value of small-scale, diverse production. Industrial agriculture tends toward large monocultures, growing the same crop across enormous areas. The Chinampas are small and diverse, with each plot containing multiple species and the overall system supporting enormous crop diversity. This diversity provides resilience. If one crop fails, others may succeed. It also provides nutritional completeness, producing a full range of nutrients rather than just calories, and it maintains genetic diversity, preserving crop varieties that might otherwise be lost. What's also instructive is the social organization that makes Chinampa agriculture possible. The physical techniques are impressive, but they're embedded in a social system of collective decision-making, mutual aid, and knowledge transmission. Modern agriculture often treats farming as an individualistic activity, But chinampa farming is fundamentally communal. The social and ecological systems are intertwined. You can't separate the technical from the social, the physical from the cultural. The Chinampas also demonstrate the importance of long-term thinking. Industrial agriculture often prioritizes short-term yields over long-term sustainability. The Chinampas were built to produce food indefinitely, not just for the next quarter or fiscal year. Techniques that would degrade the system over time were rejected in favor of approaches that maintained productivity across generations. This intergenerational perspective is almost absent from modern decision-making, but it's essential for true sustainability. There's also a lesson about adaptation and evolution. The Chinampas that survive today aren't frozen in time, unchanged from centuries ago. They've adapted to new conditions, new crops, new markets, new challenges. But this adaptation has happened while staying true to core principles, working with natural systems, maintaining diversity, valuing local knowledge. It's possible to change and adapt without abandoning tradition entirely. The Chinampas also remind us of what's been lost through the globalization of agriculture. Indigenous food systems around the world have been replaced by standardized industrial approaches with enormous losses of biodiversity, traditional knowledge, and cultural diversity. The Chinampas survived, but just barely, and their survival required active resistance to cultural erasure. What other agricultural traditions have been lost, taking with them knowledge that might be valuable today? Perhaps, most importantly, the Chinampas offer a different vision of what agriculture could be. Instead of fields stretching to the horizon, tended by machines and drenched in chemicals, imagine a landscape of small, diverse plots, worked by people who know their land intimately, producing abundance while maintaining ecological health. Instead of food traveling thousands of miles from farm to table, imagine local production feeding local communities, with transportation and storage minimized. The Chinampas show that this alternative isn't just a utopian fantasy, it's been done at scale. As the canoe approaches the dock, the old man speaks about his hopes for the Chinampas' future. He knows that what remains is a fragment of the original system, but he also knows that even this fragment contains valuable lessons. He wants young people to learn traditional techniques, not to preserve them as museum pieces, but to continue evolving them in response to new challenges. He wants researchers to study Chinampa agriculture, not just as an historical curiosity, but as a source of solutions to contemporary problems. He wants eaters to value food produced through traditional techniques, creating markets that make Chinampa farming economically viable. The sun has set now, and the sky is darkening. The sounds of the Chinampas at night are different from the daytime sounds. Frogs calling, night birds stirring, the gentle splash of water. It's a peaceful soundscape, the product of an agricultural landscape that has maintained ecological complexity rather than simplifying it into monoculture. You step out of the canoe and back onto solid ground, but your perspective has changed. You understand now that the Chinampas aren't just a historical footnote or a tourist attraction. They're a different way of thinking about agriculture, about the relationship between humans and the environment, about knowledge and tradition. In a world facing environmental crisis, food insecurity, and the loss of cultural diversity, the Chinampas offer lessons that we desperately need to learn. The old man secures the canoe and turns to leave, but before he goes, he says something that stays with you. The earth remembers. The Chinampas are part of the earth's memory, a way of knowing and working with the land that has survived against enormous odds. As we face an uncertain future, we would do well to listen to what the earth remembers, to learn from techniques that have sustained people for centuries, and to recognize that there are different ways of knowing than the one that currently dominates the world. The floating gardens of Mexico aren't just impressive engineering or clever agricultural techniques. They're a testament to human ingenuity working in harmony with natural systems, a demonstration that abundance can be created through cooperation rather than domination, and a reminder that the knowledge we need for the future may already exist in the practices we've been too quick to discard. Closing, as our journey through the Chinampas comes to an end, let yourself settle deeper into relaxation. The gentle rocking of the canoe, the soft splash of water, the rustle of crops in the breeze, let these sounds and sensations carry you towards sleep. The floating gardens of Lake Xochimilco have fed people for centuries, and tonight they can feed your imagination as you drift toward rest. Your eyes are growing heavier now, your breathing slower and deeper. Just as the Chinampa farmers work with the natural rhythms of water and soil, you can allow yourself to relax into natural rhythms of breathing and letting go. There's no need to understand everything you've learned tonight, no need to solve modern agricultural problems right now. The lessons from the floating gardens will still be there tomorrow, ready to be explored again if you choose. Feel yourself becoming heavier, more relaxed, like a willow tree's roots reaching down through the soft Chinampa soil into the cool water beneath. Each muscle in your body can let go, tension flowing out of you like water through the carefully managed canals. Your shoulders drop, your jaw loosens, your breathing becomes slow and rhythmic like the patient work of farmers who understand that some things cannot be rushed. The Chinampa farmers understood something we often forget, that working with natural systems produces better results than trying to dominate them. They didn't fight the water or the soil, they learned to work with these elements, to understand their patterns and rhythms, to create abundance through cooperation rather than control. And tonight, you can apply this same principle to your own rest. Don't fight against sleep or try to force it. Instead, work with your body's natural rhythms. Let yourself drift toward rest when you're ready. Trust that sleep will come in its own time. Imagine yourself now floating on one of those canals, surrounded by the green abundance of the Chinampas. The water gently supports you, carrying you without effort. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and growing plants. The sounds are soft and natural, water lapping, birds calling, crops stirring in the breeze. This is a place where productivity and tranquility coexist, where human activity supports rather than disrupts natural systems. Your thoughts are becoming quieter now, less distinct, like ripples spreading outward from where the canoe pole touches the water. The day's concerns, the questions about sustainable agriculture, the reflections on what's been lost and what survives all of this is fading into the background, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The Chinampas have survived for centuries by adapting while maintaining core principles. You can find your own balance between adaptation and stability, letting go of what doesn't serve while holding on to what's essential. The mysteries of how the Chinampas were developed, how they achieved such extraordinary productivity, how they survived conquest and colonization, these mysteries can wait until another day. For now, there's only the soft darkness, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the gradual surrender into sleep. Like the willow trees that anchor the Chinampas, reaching down through soil into water, you're connected to something deeper and more enduring than the surface concerns of daily life. You're safe, you're supported, you're drifting. The lessons from the floating gardens will be here when you wake, but tonight they can simply exist in the background, part of the deep knowledge that your mind carries even in sleep. Good night, sleep well, and may your rest be as peaceful and productive as the gardens that float on water, creating abundance through harmony with natural forces. 大鱼大鱼大鱼全文结束，晚安。